Good evening and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, I'm the museum director, and we're very pleased as well as honored to have you with us as our audience tonight for Poetry at the Dalí. I wanted to recognize a few of the notables here in the audience today. Poet Laureate of Florida, Peter Meinke, and his daughter Gretchen. Catherine Swintek, trustee of the Dalí Museum. Thank you for being with us. And husband to Helen Wallace, Peter Wallace, Semper Fi. As you will know, Helen Pruitt Wallace is a former Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, and she will always be in my heart as a Poet Laureate, one of our great talents in the area. She also has been so persistent and so talented in bringing great poetry to the Dalí Museum, and we appreciate that very much. I've asked her if she would open the evening by reading something of her own making to get us in the mood for these two tremendous poets who will read more substantially from their work afterwards. And one quick thank you to the city of St. Petersburg for providing us sponsorship of this event. So poetry is alive in St. Petersburg. Helen Pruitt Wallace.
Thank you so much, Hank, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. We've got a terrific program for you with Sylvia and Ahibola. So excited that you could join us. And I also want to say thank you to Hank for being so supportive of this program. We could not do it without his help and the museum's help, and also Thomas and John in the back, our tech czars. Thank you guys. They do all the live stream for us. So if you have friends who are interested in the program but we're not able to join you, tell them they can find us on our Dalí YouTube channel because of those great guys back there. And also Dr. Kim McQuarrie, who's somewhere, right? Kim, is that you? Thank you for everything. And Sumaya Ayad is usually helping us too. She couldn't be here tonight, but we couldn't do it with all of the great people here at this museum. I will read a short poem. Some of you probably are familiar with something that came out in the New York Times. It's 36 questions to ask each other to fall in love, right? Which is, it's actually pretty funny. And I don't know, maybe it works. But for this poem, I actually took a chunk out of a longer poem and opened it back up and kind of messed with it. Because since it's Valentine's Day tomorrow, this is a poem, I don't know, it's about desire. Maybe desire when you're younger, and then maybe how it changes, maybe not. So yeah, that's what I'll read tonight, and it's for my husband, Peter. Okay. I think that's all you need to know is the references to the 36 questions, is that. It started out originally, this poem was part of a sonnet crown, and then I deconstructed it, basically. A girl on a bike. I didn't know the 36 questions could lead to love. I glided through curves the way I planned to ride the rest of my life. But like the stray we adopted one fall who disappeared, that girl one day was gone. Who took her place? Brown braid snaking down her back, crazy for garage bands, the guttural pump of Inagata Vita, as oranges grew heavy in trees and fireflies pricked the night. I learned their code. My brothers riffing light my fire. I danced in mini skirts and army boots, connecting all those dots that spelled desire. Desire was everywhere and painted pink. The color of seduction, lots of famous artists painted famous mistresses in pink. Elsa Schiaparelli shocked the world with shocking pink, not to mention Marilyn Monroe pinked out head to toe in that sexy film, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Meanwhile, on our streets, if we're sinning, we don't mean it. We're just teens trying to read each other's palms or eyes closed, cataclysmic thoughts, someone every time with one eye open. Pink is pink unless you're talking leather when black's better. But pink turns into punk with just one letter. Back then, I needed no questions to fall in love with everyone. But now our fruit is fragrant on the boughs, intimate and true. If I could conjure you, you'd still be you. Thank you. And I should have said, maybe some of you saw that article also in the New York Times about 36 Hours in St. Pete, and they mentioned the Pink Streets. And I grew up down in the Pink Streets and love that neighborhood and actually have a chapbook with an earlier rendition of the Sonnet Crown in it. So yeah, that's a really cool neighborhood. And that was a neat article. It was a long article. All right, I have the great pleasure to introduce our two poets tonight, and I'm super excited to have both of them here. I do want to first say a shout out to Caridad Moro-Granlier, who was originally supposed to be reading for us. She had an emergency, was not able to come. We hope to have her back some other time. So, but fortunately we have Alibola Talese, who is going to read first, and Ajibola is a Nigerian poet and essayist. He graduated from the Creative Writing MFA program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His chapbook, Kula Libitos, was published as part of the New Generation African Poets series, edited by Kwame Dawes and Chris Abana in 2021. His writing has appeared in Lit Hub, New England Review, Prairie Schooner, Poetry, and elsewhere. He's a former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University and has received a creative writing grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation. He's the 2023 and 2024 Olive B. O'Connor Fellow in Poetry at Colgate University, and also now teaching at USF Tampa. We're so happy to have you in the area. And the other thing, he's the author of 2000 Blacks, winner of the 2024 Cave Canem Poetry Prize, which is actually a really big deal. And just last week, he found out that his book has won the gold medal for the Florida Book Awards. So congratulations.
Thank you all so much for being here. You're such a good audience for poetry. It's a lot of you. It's unusual for poetry. So poetry is very much alive in St. Pete. Yeah. I'm going to read from my book, 2000 Blacks, but before I read from the book, I want to read something I've been working on, something relatively new. This poem's titled Work Song. I used to have an aunt who lived in Chicago, and we kind of didn't get along. And, I just kind of imagined a relationship where I have to move to my aunt. And it would make for an interesting thing to write a poem about. So, Work Song. Allow me to offer advice, since all our experts are unavailable. It is best to bubble wrap the Chinaware, lest you cringe when the box drops before it arrives. Chicago, where your aunt who micromanages you over the phone is waiting in a different time zone. If you were not terrified, you'd mention with ease that the bowl broke before sending it. You won't blame the mailman for careless handling. You placate your aunt. You're a brilliant man who gets ice cream on happy days. This is who you are. Is it Machiavelli or Hollywood? Who proposed the opposite of fear is love? This is incorrect. Something is always lost. The opposite of fear is cinnamon or juice. You are in the world of poems where everything is true and absolute knowledge is impossible. If you are following, nothing is like another. Language may or may not be a vehicle for ideas, depending on what's been exchanged. The truck in motion with all your possessions is hurtling towards a strange city. There is no new home. Your aunt is still waiting for you in the bus station parking lot. The poem opens into a scene in which you are a child in your aunt's home. Do not pretend this is a metaphor. You are lost and have no one to question, except the aunt who is helping you start your life over. Do you remember the photo in which she held you as a baby? She is sure she can be your mother. You are not hers. You might wonder where this poem is taking you. The truck with everything that's yours will not arrive. Understand this. Nothing is yours. This is the wisdom of poetry. The language you value so much is your master. You need not wrestle an animal you cannot win. Submit to chaos. The poem is its own machine. There is no X factor. There is no figuring it out. Continue to toil until the year is given. Say yes when you can. See what you get for effort. It won't be much, but your zeal may not be unnoticed. In the end, you still don't know what anything is. Thank you all. The first poem I'll read from the book is a poem titled Boy. I'm reading because she had read a poem with a bicycle in it. I fell off my bike and broke into a dance. If ever reached me, telling me to let the water take him. Sometimes I believe I'm in a dream until a cop approaches me in a grocery store with his gun drawn. Glory to the days I don't die. I think about the Lagos that I may never see again, where the dead migrants might have arrived without welcome. I used to like to put my feet in the water at the shore. It used to soothe me to think whatever washed off my skin will make it to the West African coast. Lord, I'm on my knees tonight. Open my voice cuts through the voice of... Lord, I'm on my knees tonight. Open my voice cuts through the noise of planes landing in San Francisco. There's more of us arriving in London, New York, and Paris with familiar hunger. They say the earth is red because it is scorched, but I know it's the blood from all the wars. Like all the expats who visited Freetown said it was difficult to watch the killings, but they didn't say they kept the diamonds. They made their wealth from killings and diamonds. I know I'm here and I don't belong when people pretend to reference the land when they say they've rescued migrants from dirt. When I object, they reach for their purse before they shove their fists in my mouth. Then they say, let's talk Kigali and Monrovia. Once I met a man on the street who said he just wanted to be proud of his dark skin. For him, I brought Mansa Musa back to life, but the trolleys of gold didn't relieve him. That was a year after I kissed a woman who is now dead because she spoke eloquent Bambara. She asked if I wanted her tongue and all its stories. Everywhere we went, they called our accents Ghanaian, and we're wrong every time. I don't recall the woman's words, but the charge of her voice, elegant as the musings of a poet. I can wind the clock back to summer in Bamako, where our skins fitted among bodies marching at a rally. Fela Kuti, thumping from the speakers, repeatedly saying, "This is why black men cry." Thank you all. I know black Africans too broken to cry or speak. I lie to men who seem to need my help with their affairs. Take the man on the street corner who asked if I date outside my ethnicity. I can't tell why I lied since I considered myself cosmopolitan. Perhaps he suspected I'm as lost as he is. There's a Gambian I ran into who was celebrating the Independence Day of a nation he was exiled from, until I ruined it when I mentioned our countries are mapped by colonial instincts. One time I lost my keys and it didn't hurt since I already lost my country. I don't want these words to mean I'm struggling. For many years, I spoke loudly over people who called me a migrant. I'm an international student, I say. Yet I'm unable to split the difference. What I don't mention is the plot to remain here. My mother over the phone saying there's nothing to return to. My father croning beside her saying, tell him to send some dollars. The exchange rate is good. He sends dollars home since the exchange rate is good. His father, an unpaid professor in a West African country, calls him a horse, which would have been funny if he doesn't work too hard. He has worked since his first job at the convenience store at 7. Now, you might have seen him in your neighborhood, curb mining on weeknights. He avoids talking about money, politics, and power out of fear that it might sound needful, which may cause you to despise him and have him removed. It is American to disdain the poor, but he doesn't say this except on phone calls to friends back home who think he's stingy with his time. He spends his leisure hours making love over video call to his lover 1,000 miles across the sea. She often asks him to come home because there's violence against people seeking refuge everywhere in the world. He stays anyway and tells her it's not a bad life. He stays anyway because he has paid $65 for a bad life and a marriage license in Plainfield. At the ceremony, he thought he saw his lover in the room, crying in the corner. He rubs his eyes and she's a waiter who has been yelled at over broken chinaware. He's afraid his wife isn't smiling wide enough for this pretense to fool an immigration officer who will look at these photos for evidence of love before adjudicating his permanent residency application. What he wants to do is don a suit and be his grandfather, whose eyes continue to follow him many years after he died in his sleep, his whole hands holding onto themselves as if excited to be traveling again as he did in his youth. The next poem I'd read to you. So when I left Nigeria in 2019, I moved to Wisconsin. You can imagine. It was cold. It was brutally cold. And, if you've ever lived in the Midwest, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so this poem's titled Midwest in the Spring, because it snows all the way till May, and you never get any spring. Midwest in the spring. It is the third day of rain and everyone hates it, but not because the floor is trembling from cold. I disembark at the train station into a puddle. Downtown is porous. Many times I go by unnoticed, a strange man in a strange city. My apartment is 1,000 exact steps from here. I turn the corner into 3rd Street. Children are sledding off the remnants of snow. Did I mention it is the early days of spring? I carry a bag of groceries with gloved hands past the thawing lake where a neighbor's wife fell through. In a different country where they say a tiger is in labor, when the sun shines through rain, my grandmother has died. But I won't know for another day. Tonight, I will cook the bean soup she saw is best in the wet season. Then I'll eat. So, I'll read you 2 more poems. You have been very great. I will read you a poem titled New Year Problem, because everyone here is old enough to remember Y2K. I teach undergraduate, and I don't know what that is. So, New Year Problem. Everyone wrote Y2K to mean the year 2000. I could have pretended to be confused since I was 6, and we wrote 96 for the year the Olympics was held in Atlanta, regardless of the Centennial Park bombing. I celebrated with dread that the next contest would be in 2000. We were scared of the new millennium because computers would confuse 00 for any period in time. Or we could be visited by the disasters of the previous century. There was the Great War and the flu in the early years of the last century. We could be wrong to think of this as bad luck, rather than our inherent disposition. As we transition into this new year, grieving our dead from the virus and armies positioned for a takeover somewhere in the world. I'm uninterested in armies and bombings and medals, but the soldiers who will die before he fires his first rifle, and the athlete rendered invalid before the Olympic Games. The privacy of the Alvosas in a world that goes on and on. I know how he feels. My home was robbed on the first day of the century. Everyone was busy watching fireworks. they failed to notice my sister had no shoes. So I'm going to leave you with this last poem. It's kind of like the last poem I wrote for the book. Kind of like gives you the idea of the book. You know, the book does a lot of things, but every time I read this book, I purposefully don't read the poems about the fathers, about my father. I call them the father poems. But in this last poem, I've tried to bring everything together so that it kind of gives you an idea. The poem's titled Nomad. Nomad. Alligator peppers stewed in a pot will make anyone cry. A tear for my father, bent over his bow in a shack on the land his father cultivated. See him cutting his trees. I always see him like that. Even now that he has worked a deal that allowed him back in the house with my mother, who won't cook him eggs for dinner. My father, who can farm or bring water to a boil, but fought my mother over food and gossip. A tear for all the years I spent gathering news of his whereabouts. He left on a Sunday. His leaving made our house like a barren field over which a hawk caws. I saw him in the market. I saw him by the lake, where I lacked the courage to stop him on the jetty. I could have asked why he hurt me so, but I went on not knowing how to reconcile a father and a son. A tear for my mother, who endured long years without word. She waited with me in a house falling apart on Mango Street. I thought it was bad omen to wait until we are visited with news. I left the country, but dreamt of the house with its wide windows open. I stood outside and watched the hawk disappear into the walls. What purpose does a dream serve a son without his mother? To whom does it take his questions in a new country? Every man looks like my father from afar until I reach them and they are someone else's father. I have met doctors who have asked me to share my sorrows. I always hesitate because I fear they pretend they can teach me to forgive my father. I don't want to. I only seek to understand what he left behind. I cannot mend my father. I cannot vouch for my interpretation of the dream with the hawk beating its wings against the wall. I thought it meant the wall was my father, a huge hex scrawled on the door to mean no access. I must go on into the years ahead. All the effort towards knowledge of my father comes to zero. A tear for time spent without resolution. A tear for my father. Thank you all.
What a terrific reading. Thank you so much, Aibola. Aren't we lucky to have him in our area? Oh, yeah. And your students are lucky as well. So, and now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sylvia Curbelo. I've known Sylvia for so many years. We've been in a writing group for, almost 20 years. It's a long time. And Sylvia writes such exquisite poems, and I know many of you have probably heard her read before. I should say, first of all, I want to say a shout out to Tombola Books, who is out front selling their books. Please, after the reading, go back and buy their books, and you don't want to miss the chance to see their powerful words actually on the page. It just makes such a difference. Sylvia is the author of 2 full-length poetry collections, Falling Landscape and The Secret History of Water, both available from Anhinga Press, and also 2 chapbooks. Awards include poetry fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, the Centus Foundation, and the Writer's Voice, as well as the Jessica Noble Maxwell Poetry Prize from American Poetry Review, which is a big deal. Her poems have been published widely in literary journals and in more than 36 anthologies, including Helen Vindler's Poems, Poets, and Poetry, published by Bedford St. Martin, and also the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature, W.W. Norton. A native of Cuba, Sylvia has lived in Tampa all of her adult life. Big warm welcome for Sylvia Curbelo.
Nice introduction.
please. All right, good evening, everyone. It's a nice crowd. I'm really happy about that. I'm thrilled to be back to the Dalí Museums and my favorite poetry reading series ever. I want to thank Helen for inviting me, and of course Hank for making it all possible. And I was actually one of the readers at the very first Poetry at the Dalí. How many years ago was that? Is that even possible? Yeah, I read with Don Morrow and Phyllis McEwen. And that was a great night. But so it's always an honor to come back. So I thought I'd start with a poem that I use to open readings a lot. There's certain poems that have that vibe, and this one is one of them for me. I went to a writer's retreat, and I was going through a dry period where I hadn't written in several months. And so I was kind of rusty and nervous about being unable to write and having all this time and nothing to do. And so I wrote, I started with a brainstorming exercise, and just did that for a couple of hours, and much to my surprise, this poem kind of showed up on the page. So, and it came very quickly, which is rare for me. And this is called After the Rain, and it's a poem about the writing process, but it's also a poem about the process of not writing. After the rain, out of practice in the quiet, a small cloud breaking above the tree line, letting the darkness in. We breathe in the old perfume. The disappearing world like a story we once knew, the first limits of language. 2 stars, 2 kinds of shadow, and no moon. Resolve rises like steam from an old cup. Look how stubbornly the light clings to the trees, how young we are, how brave this moment. You don't have to clap after every poem, it's fine. This poem is actually brand new, but the idea had been kind of banging around in my head for years, maybe even decades. I'm a big fan of used bookstores. I'm a big fan of all bookstores, but used bookstores are particularly close to my heart. I love the way they smell. I love seeing all those books all piled up in the corners. I love finding, that little treasure for $2 or $3. So you take it home, and then you open it, and someone has written all over the margins, and you're like mortified at first, but then you start looking, and reading what this person has written, and you start to get a sense of who the person is, or maybe what they've gone through. And so I've always thought that was an interesting concept, and I've been playing around with it, like I said, for years. And so I wrote this piece. And I love the fact that there's a word for that, marginalia, right, which means writing on the margins of books. I didn't know that. But I thought that was a great word. This is called To the Woman Who Scribbled in the Margins of the Used Poetry Book. Who were you back then, with your heart in the balance, with your days spinning out, random as being alive? His name a wild taste to hold in your mouth, blue stone, blue ink of morning, the weight of a pain you can't carry and you can't put down, so you blink hard and swallow. Bad nights, terrible music, piano chords undone by blood or memory, in bars, in books, in the back seats of cars, and a page like the first loneliness, blue ink staining your tongue, the blade of his hands like the jagged edges of a star, hard rain filling the space where you stand, word deep in loss, tethered to nothing but the sound of this poem turning its back on love. So I feel like there's nothing more important to a writer than the companionship and friendship of other writers. And this is particularly true when you're starting out, when you're young, and you forge these friendships with other writers that maybe you can't quite forge when you're older. So this next poem goes to all the people who sat with me in all-night diners talking shop and lent me their books and their movies and their records and opened bottles of wine and poured endless cups of coffee and let me call them at 2 o'clock in the morning to read them my latest poem. This one goes out to you. This is called Some Nights We Stand Together and Watch the Pages Burn. I miss the days of unabashed relief, sizzle of words and blue neon, the sky spilling out like some emergency we're all running toward. I miss the whole idea of luck, good or bad. Whatever happens is happening to everyone, and we know it. I miss my unrepentant solitude. I miss the element of surprise, like sudden mist or an alley dressed with snow. I miss the long rooms of childhood and standing barefoot in the weeds, watching the rain land like a beautiful idea. I miss dancing to a music like that. I miss music and the first happiness like a new loaf of bread. I miss the certainty of train tracks and the way a train whistle shapes the distance, a door just beginning to close. I miss the half-hearted moonlight in late July and diners at 3 a.m., the bottomless cup of something true, balm and revelry of black coffee, the whole shebang of the night sky. I miss the reckless span of bridges holding two severed halves of anywhere. But mostly, I miss you reading this poem, telling me the future owes us nothing but this moment, then the next one. And that's how it goes. The splendid arc of the unknowable, sirens and luck. The way this page, too, is an emergency. How even as I write this, the windows are on fire. Thank you. Okay, so on a lighter note, this is a poem that I kind of had fun writing. I had gone to another writer's retreat. I do those a lot. And I started texting with my good friend Heather Sellers, who she read here a couple of months ago. She's wonderful, wonderful poet, wonderful fiction writer. So we're texting back and forth, and you know, I'm kind of complaining like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to write. And so she says, would you like a writing prompt? And I hate writing prompts. I just feel like they're the kiss of death. You know, you tell me, write a poem about this, and it's just not going to happen. But, you know, I said, well, I'm here. I have nothing else to do, so what the heck? So she sent me 4 emojis and told me, write a poem about these. And she sent me a dancing girl, an umbrella, a skull and crossbones, And what was the last one? Oh yeah, a lip print, like on a napkin, like red lips on a piece of paper kind of thing, like a kiss. So I thought that was ridiculous, but I thought, what the heck? And I wrote this poem, and I mean, I don't know if it's any good or not, but I had fun writing, and it's called Stories. In every story about rain, an aging princess daydreams about eternity. Umbrellas bloom like violent afterthoughts. Any girl dancing beside a fountain could be a prophecy or just a product of the weather. Her simple skirt, the color of too late. Tired of the usual talk, bored angels gossip about desire. The anarchy of scars and distances. The way hair being brushed sounds like delicate breathing. You walk the wet streets with your voice tucked inside you, so helpless you could sleep through every kiss. All right. So I've selected a couple of poems from each of my books because you can't ignore the older children in favor of the new children. So this is from my first collection, The Secret History of Water, which actually came out in '97, so it's pretty old, but it's still in print, so that's good. This poem is for my good friend Renee Ashley, another wonderful poet and fiction writer. She's sadly no longer with us. Renee suffered from schizophrenia. She was diagnosed in her late 20s. But I mean, she struggled with the disease all her life, but she had a great sense of humor about it. I remember every couple of years she would end up in a hospital for several weeks at a time. And at one point she went to St. Joseph's psychiatric ward. And I go to my mailbox and there's a postcard from Renee. And in the front is a picture of St. Joseph's Hospital. And on the back it says, "Having a great time, wish you were here." So this is for Renee. It's called Wish. The poem is sadder than the story, I'm afraid. The difference between then and now could be wind lifting this page. The memory of that house rises like a wave, and the world floats up through its reflection. I'm walking through weeds and old lace, the simple furniture of grief. Metaphors are what remain intact, what are endlessly returning. Here is childhood's blue pond, the apple of sleep. All morning, the light seemed to swallow all the light. You were wearing a blouse made entirely of tiny fish, set adrift on a flat blue surface that resembled the sea. It wanted to be the sea. Water is an abstraction until you hold it to your lips. The way a kiss belies its own intentions, a wolf in wolf's clothing. In another story, an apple dreams itself into a rose. A pond retraces someone's shadow from memory and imagines any cloud reflected on its surface is a wave. Some dreams are both bread and hunger. Faith is cool water under the tongue. This story is an island. A girl closes her eyes, simple as an apple, takes the first bite like she's never been kissed. And because tomorrow is Valentine's Day, I would be remiss if I did not read a love poem. So this is actually the title poem for my book, The Secret History of Water. There are 3 poems in the book titled that. They're all love poems. This is number 2. And it's for my husband, who wasn't allowed to come because he makes me nervous when he comes to my readings. The room was a pond with one wave in it. Words floated to the ceiling of your voice. The way you put your hand there and there, a kind of swimming out of reason or loneliness. I imagined the face behind my face was more beautiful, an elusive and more difficult image of myself. Holding my breath like a child, I waited for storm clouds to pass, for an old silence gathering behind trees. A few years ago now. And so I wrote this poem, and it's called Painting Gala. As all of you probably know, Gala was Dalí's wife, whom he adored. He painted her hundreds of times. She appears in many of his, hundreds of his paintings, sometimes as the central figure, sometimes as a little figure in the corner. But so I started writing this by describing actual paintings. And then as the poem developed, I just started coming up with paintings that Dalí maybe should have painted that he didn't. Or, if he had asked me, I would have told him, hey, paint this. But he didn't ask. So this is Painting Gala. Gala in childhood, in rain, in white garments, on a train with a book and a suitcase. Gala with swans untouched by sadness, feathers tumbling from her mouth, without shoes, with a glass of warm milk, sitting cross-legged in the garden chair. Gala in a taxi, in sleep, in love with silence, her good friend, her confidant, and behind her left shoulder, the road, a Madonna, a bird, a many-ringed thing like a tree trunk, windblown, sullen as a starfish, marooned, a beached thing, moonlight spreading the grayed satin sheet of her dreams, her pillow licked by flames, the nightgown burning, torn loose, rising like smoke, like Gala in her suit of lights. So many stars in her arms, so many dead leaves. Gala with storm clouds in free fall, with pearls in her lap and blood money in her fist, a sudden loneliness in the folds of her green dress. So many untold distances unfolding from her whispering fingers, awash in sunlight, lounging poolside with a paper umbrella in her drink, swallowing every wish. And I'm going to close with a poem I wrote for my mother. It's more recent, it's not terribly recent, but my mom passed away almost 20 years ago now. It doesn't seem possible, but this is called Mother's Garden. Because green is always the beginning. You start there. You open the smallest window and peer out. It was the best part of the day. It was growing season. Thick clouds balanced on the ledge of the horizon, heavy with their secret. Elsewhere, the sky flew by. Where did you run to that summer afternoon while the light froze and the rain held its breath? The past makes its own landscape. The way every seed is a reminder, an inkling, a sweetness. In your hands, something blooms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and also Ajimbola. Thank you. Two terrific readings, just so good. And one of the things that strikes me is how the images that both of these poets, show us throughout their poems. We need to talk about that. We're going to segue into our Q&A. And so if you have a question, just raise your hand, and Dr. Kim in the back has a microphone so that people listening to the live stream will be able to hear your question and their answer as well. So.
Hello. Sylvia, your mother tongue is Spanish? Yes. So do you write in Spanish? Do you write in English? Do you do both?
Is this on? Oh, it is on. Okay. I have tried writing in Spanish. I don't feel like I have as much of an ability in Spanish. I've done 90% of my reading in English. So even though I've published a couple of poems in Spanish, I don't feel they're as good. So I just, I listen to what the poem tells me. And if a poem ever tells me, hey, write me in Spanish, then I will do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have some words that you may weave in that are just individual words that might pop up? I'm trying to think of any poems that I'm familiar with where you maybe use a Spanish word, if not the whole, even if the whole poem is not.
I haven't done that too much. I mean, there's a few poems, but mostly my first book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my first book is more about my life in Cuba, my childhood, and then I kind of moved on from that.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that's one of the things that you guys both share. I mean, you both moved to this country from other places, and even your imagery with a lot of water. I know both of you have a lot of water in your work. But questions from you all first. Anybody else? Others? Hervey.
I think the appropriate second question is the same question to you. Do you write poetry in your language of origin, and how much was English your language of origin?
I started studying English at like age 4, but I speak like 3 to 4 indigenous Nigerian languages, and I write in 2 of them, and I have 2 poems in the book titled Brother Man that was written in Nigerian Pidgin, just, for the chance that a Nigerian in the US will come across them and feel like I wrote for them.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Other questions? Yes, up front.
Thank you. Hi. A question to both of you, and that question actually arises from my previous experience here when, I don't remember exactly who, maybe Heather, mentioned that it's very important for her the poems to be read, to be heard, to be read loud. And that was such a, in a way, shocking experience to me, because I love poetry and read poetry every day. And for me, that's a very private experience. I read it, I don't speak it loud. So I want to just hear your thoughts on that. I mean, how is your experience? When you write, do you envision somebody reading it, speaking it loud? Like, I don't know. How do you feel when you hear your poem being read? And during the process, do you say the words loud? And I don't know. I was really moved by that question, by that statement from Heather. I'm pretty sure it was Heather. I'm curious.
I agree with Heather, because, I know that when I'm writing, I have to say it out loud, which is why I like to be alone when I'm writing, because I've been walking around the room, kind of saying the words, and if they don't flow, then I know something's wrong. Because to me, it's as much about the sound as it is about the images, But I can understand you're saying that it's a private experience for you too, because when I read other people's poems, I don't read them out loud. I read them to myself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I agree. in my own writing practice, I always read the poem out loud. But I feel like, because the music of the poem is important to me, but the music of the poem is going to be different to different readers. You know, it's kind of like just like how you like different kind of music. Some people don't like Chopin. There's nothing you can do about it. So, you know, so when I write the poem, I would pace in the room while I read the poem so that I can like get the beat of the poem. And sometimes the word is not right because it's just like 6 syllables or 4 syllables and everything else is like 2-1, 2-1, right? So like writing the poem, the music is central to the writing of the poem. But I hope that, you know, when people read it, it makes it a music of its own, right? So that they have something that's theirs and personal in that way that's different from when you've heard me read it.
I think that's such a good question, and I think it's really important to read your work aloud, and even other people's work aloud. And if if it feels like a private experience, maybe it's just something you do in your own home. But to be able to hear that voice, and if you're writing the poem, to be able to revise from the ear, because your ear will pick up things that your eye won't. You know, so I would always encourage the students I had when I was teaching at Eckerd to always do that revision by reading the poems aloud. I think it's pretty important. Yeah, and also I'm thinking, I know, Ajibola, you write often in form. In fact, I'm not quite sure. The long poem that you read certainly had a lot of the structure of a sonic crown. Yes, okay. So you all probably heard that too. You would hear that when he would finish one stanza, that last line then would become another, the very first line of the next stanza, at least some variation of it, maybe, yeah. And it was wonderful in that way. But especially if you're doing any kind of well, I don't even want to single that out. I think all poems, doesn't even have to be formal poems, that can benefit from being read aloud. But can you talk? I'd like to, if it's okay, jump in and say, can you both talk a little bit about? I'd love to hear your thoughts on form, because I think you, in looking at your book, you have several poems. You're kind of playing around with different forms. You have the acrostic poem. Would you talk a little bit about that and how you choose? Do you sit down knowing you're going to write in a particular form? Do you let the poem lead you and see where it goes? What are your thoughts on form?
I really want to say something smart, but it's not. I promise you, it's not. When I'm writing, I'm usually bored. Like,
you're bored when you're
yeah,
writing?
because you say you want to write a poem about a mother. There's already 1,001 poem about mothers, right? So I'm like, what can I do to make this more exciting? And that's my introduction to form. I'm like, I'm going to make it a sestina. Can I write 39 lines about my mother? Right. So it kind of like adds a level of challenge to the poem. And when it's challenging, now I'm excited. And sometimes I start with the poem in 3 verse. I write the poem and I'm like, I like it, but people won't, because they would feel like this is cheesy, Then I'm like, yeah, for that English professor who's going to read this poem, here's a poem in iambic pentameter, then work that into the language of the poem. But the form either starts with the poem or it comes in the revision of the poem. But I feel like it's always an added layer of, complexity to the subject matter of the poem to have form. Because when form and content matches, then, like if you're writing a poem about a biography and use the acrostic form, you go from A to Z, right? So like, and it's like the whole life of someone in that A to Z. It kind of like feels
You're using
right.
all the letters of the alphabet in the
Yeah, like each line, the first line starts with an A, the second line starts with a B, and by the end of the poem, the last line starts with a Z. So it kind of like feels right that, this whole life is contained in this form. So yeah, that's what form does for me, just a way to kind of like mirror content.
Yeah. And if you think of villanelles, as many people will talk about how it's a particularly good form for something that you're dealing with that's hard, some sort of grief or something, because the form itself is compressed, and that use of repetition, that first and third, and the rhyme, just that compressed form alone adds to, it creates sort of a vessel that is right sometimes for some sort of grief. But I also want to say that even taking the poem back apart again, you might play around with the form and then realize, as I'm sort of tried to do with the Sonic Crown, I have now sort of deconstructed it. I think it's maybe good to be willing to write them one way and take them apart and, mess with them as you go until it feels right. And even open forms. And Sylvia, you write more in what I would call open forms.
Yeah, I've tried my hand at form. I completed one villanelle that I actually liked, but overall, I mean, I've tried many times. I've always wanted to write a good villanelle, and I've not managed it. What I find is that when I attempt to form, at some point I abandoned it, but then I've got a better poem. It's like it kind of has taken me to a different place that I might not have.
Right.
So I'm thinking if I keep trying, maybe eventually I will write a good villanelle or a good sestina or.
Yeah.
I think the villanelle is the hardest form.
Like I have plenty of them in the bag.
Well, it's just making sure you're not just kind of repeating the same thing over and over. It has to change, every step. Yeah. It's hard. Other questions, thoughts from you? Yes, back here. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, we'll come to you next.
So thanks very much. Here's a question about technology. There is a book that was written in March of 2021 by a big Silicon Valley investor, Reed, for some reason I can't remember his last name. It's called Impromptu, and he wrote it with a co-author. His co-author was ChatGPT-4. So my question is, do you ever think about attempting something like that?
And you mean using ChatGPT in the writing of a poem? Is that what you mean? No, co-authoring. Oh, co-authoring with ChatGPT. Ah.
He wrote it with his co-author.
So do you mean like a collaboration type thing? Yeah, I've done that with poems, not an entire book, but I've tried co-writing with friends. I did a piece, I can't remember the name of it now, with a poet named Dionisio Martinez, a wonderful poet in the area. I think he stopped writing, sadly, but we did this piece where we took a bunch of our poems and just combined them and made them into like a performance piece, and it was about 20 minutes long. And oh God, I wish I could remember the name of it. But anyway, something like that I've done, but not for a long time.
And Catherine, did you mean specifically that your collaborator would be ChatGPT? Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about ChatGPT a little bit?
No. It was still,
it's
it's fine.
Your students will hear this.
Now I'm terrified. I have a generative AI policy in my class, which is don't use it, which is I understand is restrictive, right, to what it can do. But I'm also terrified of technology. Like I read a Y2K poem. Like I'm from that era where, like I write in cursives because I learned that in school. Like it's just how we did things, and it's difficult for me to kind of like just move into this new stuff. Because my ways are kind of like already formed. So I don't see myself, like I feel like ChatGPT would have cheesy rhymes. I don't rhyme. It will lack the originality that I have in a way that just kind of like doesn't, because, it has this fixed definition of what a poem is. And a poem is much more than what we could teach in an algorithm that a poem is. Whatever, like what makes an artist is that, we're able to think outside of the rules and the restrictions that we've created, and an algorithm will only work within that. And so I think it's not something I'd be open to for that reason.
I want to say that I think it provides a, kind of an interesting new way of accessing information for poets. There's a way to use it to come up with a lot of different turns for your poem and information and ideas that you might not necessarily come up with. But then the writing of it, I'm sure all of you probably, or many of you have read poems written by ChatGPT, and many of them are pretty insipid, But I think it could be used as a tool to get information that you then put in an order and associate, and I kind of am excited to think in terms of how it can shake up the research that can be super useful in opening up a poem. So I like that aspect of it, and would be interested in doing that a little bit more. But yeah, if asking it to write a poem in the style of Silvia or Corbello, and it's not going to be Silvia or Corbello, at least not now. But you know what? I mean, they say it's learning more and more all the time, and so maybe at some point it will be. And Silvia will do something different. Other questions? Oh, that's right here. Yeah.
First, thank you all for reading tonight. So I heard in your poem you had mentioned Iron Butterfly, and in yours you had mentioned Fela Kuti. So I was wondering how important music is to either your writing process or to either providing additional sensory context for your work.
Music is like essential to me. Like I feel like you cannot remove poetry from music, and you can't necessarily separate both. And I write every day, or I should say I try to write every day, but my book is a slim book, which is to say that I write a lot of things that don't make it into the book, but I got to practice every day. And music is essential. So like I always just like my writing practice, which is, I was having this conversation with a friend, is I'm currently writing this poems for Nina Simone. And she was like, why are you writing Nina Simone poems? I'm like, it's what I'm listening to. I got to write back to what I'm listening to. So when I'm listening to Fela Kuti, it's like that voice in my head, and I'll write back to Fela Kuti. So yeah, music is, it's essential. It's part of how we live our daily lives. You're driving to work, you have the music on, and then, you internalize some of it, and then you kind of like speak back to that musician.
Yeah. Sylvia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Music is everything in poetry. My husband's a musician, so I have that going for me.
There's a question. Yeah, she's coming.
This is a two-part question. I have a loud mouth, so I may not even need this. So this is for both of you regarding the question of music. So do you tend to like instrumental, or do you want lyrics when you're listening to background music to motivate you to maybe write whatever you're focusing on at that time? What type of music do you listen to? Instrumental, or do you want a lyric?
For me, it's got to be instrumental, because I mean, I listen to the music beforehand, not during the process of writing, unless it's instrumental. Otherwise, I find that the lyrics kind of, I can't concentrate. It's kind of.
And then the other question I have, and then you're done with me, because I tend to talk a lot. So what made you both go into poetry versus writing novels, or, the story of poetry? What drew you to poetry? I'm not.
Yeah, your music question.
I'm sorry.
Great. I could not do, I can listen to anything before I get to the desk to write. Once I get to the desk to write, if the song has lyrics, the words tend to want to jump onto the page. Yeah. And, you got to shut that out. Or I have to shut that out. That's my practice. But I also find that instrumentals just drone on for too long. So I do most of my writing without actual music. Then I live my daily life with music. Why did I not write a novel? It's hard. It's a tricky question. And, this is not to belittle the work of novelists and, of anyone. I think novels say, I think what the novelist is trying to do, the poet does in much more precise language and brevity. And I love brevity. I want to get out of people's faces as quick as possible.
Yeah, the best way I ever heard that described is like when you're in a novel, You're walking down the street, you get to the door, you open the door, you look for your keys, you open the door, you get in. In the poem, you're in the room already. So
Yeah.
I thought that was a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think the best poems are enacting what's happening rather than just allowing us to read them. They're actually creating a world that we enter into, and yeah. I'd love to have both of you talk about what you think makes a good poem, and a little bit more about your writing process, including how you go about revision.
What was the first one?
What do you think makes a good poem? Actually, you know what I should say. This is a question Peter Mikey asks in his book, his writing craft book, The Shape of Poetry. So, what makes a good poem?
Well, to me,
Yeah.
To me, a good poem is a poem that takes me somewhere I've never been before, but then also a poem that takes me somewhere that I'm very familiar with, and it's kind of reflecting my own emotional state. Just something that makes me want to run to the... Is that Alexa? I forgot what I was saying. That was too
Makes you
good.
want to run.
Well, the poem makes me want to go somewhere that I've never been before. And it makes me want to run to the computer or to the
Sit down. Yeah.
the pad and start writing. That's, to me, that's of somebody else's poem. My own, I don't know. My own work, I don't know when I've written a good poem or not. It takes a few days and probably, a workshop group.
So how do you go about your revision?
My revision?
Your revision process?
Generally, I tend to focus on the lines. And so I think that's the strength of my good poems, but it's also the weakness in my poems that aren't quite so good. I mean, to me, the line, I start by writing one line, and I get that as perfect as I can, and then I move on to another line that's many times has nothing to do with the original line. It's just something that popped into my head. And so I write a bunch of lines. I end up with 20, 30 lines. I don't write linearly at all. And then I try to put the lines together and remove stuff that isn't working. And it's a very slow process, and I don't recommend it.
So that is so interesting. In all these years, I don't think I understood that you did that. One of the things I love so much about your work is it's just so imagistic. It's really sort of surreal. You have these metaphors that just bump up against each other that just absolutely work, but I would have never known to put them together. But it explains a lot that you approach it truly line by line before you move. That's really
interesting. And it's funny, there was an exercise. I did a workshop with John Ashbery many years ago, and he gave us an exercise where you write haiku, nothing but haiku, not it can be free verse haiku, it didn't have to be counting syllables, but you write haiku for like a week. So by the end, you have like maybe 50, 60, 100 haiku, and then you go through them and start making those connections.
Interesting.
And I remember thinking, that's how I write all the time.
And then you put the haiku together into a long poem? Is that
right? Right. And I've actually used it, and I've come up with some poems.
Interesting.
About a half a dozen poems or so that way. But it's a great exercise.
And a wonderful local poet who has read for us here, Don Morrill, is working on a book of haiku. He's terrific. Many of you probably know him. But yeah, he's doing a lot of that. Thank you. That was interesting.
You see, that's the thing about AI. You try to shut them out, and they kind of like just want to take over the whole thing. I apologize for that. My writing process, I try to write every day because I feel like, I'm not one of, I don't believe in inspiration, as it were. I think of writing as much as a profession in the way I think about doctors. I can't imagine going to see my doctor and it was like, I'm not inspired today. Like, I'll take my copay back. And then then I call my insurance. But I think poetry also has that utilitarian need. Like we had that pandemic, right? And everyone all of a sudden wanted to read Mary Oliver, and it's something about the poet's ability to connect with the core humanity of its reader. And I think that if you're in the service of doing that work, we also cannot be tired. So every day when I wake up, I read a poem. I have books, stack of poetry book by my nightstand. I read a poem before I sleep. I read a poem when I wake up.
You read a poem or you write a poem?
I read a poem before I sleep. I read a poem when I wake up. It's the first things these are the first things I do after I put my phone down at night and before I touch my phone in the morning.
Great.
So when I do that, one of the things I'm trying to do is to reacquaint myself with the rhythm of the English verse. Then I go about my day, and if I already have an idea, I sit down and before I eat breakfast, and I try to write, and I get the first draft out. If I'm lucky, the poem would already have its subject in it on lucky days, on days that I'm inspired. On days that I'm not inspired, I would ramble on and on and on for about 40 lines, then eventually find something I'm interested in. But it's already time to go to prepare for my class, so I'd leave that. And then I'll come back to the poem a week later, or 2 weeks later, and I'd have written like 10 drafts, 17 drafts, whatever. And I would have written those poems, and I'll read them again for the line that sparks. Because that's what my subconscious is actually excited about. Then what sparks to me, I'll delete every other thing and start from there. And then I'll just write multiple drafts of that until I have something that I can work with. So the poem never gets done. Like the one poem the earliest I've done a poem, this January I did an exercise where I wrote a poem a day, and I would write successive drafts of it until I got to something I liked. And it was a more intense experiment because it took like 10 drafts. But in the other thing, it would take like 7 drafts. So like I could save 3 writing drafts.
And when you write your drafts at first, are you going line by line like Sylvia's talking about, or are you just getting the whole thing down and then you go back?
I have to get the whole thing down.
Yep.
I have to be clear. I have to be clear what the narrative structure is. Then when I'm clear, it's a lot easier to work with. I forgot what the other question is besides writing process, but
Revision.
Oh, revision. I think I got to it too. Yeah.
And Peter, Mikey, if you don't mind, your wonderful book, The Shape of Poetry, you have a whole chapter on what makes a good poem. In your book, The Shape of Poetry, your chapter on what makes a good poem, you have so many good ideas listed there for things that you think create good poems. I know music is one of at the top of your list, I think, in that chapter.
It has to sound good. It's not prose. It's got to be not too prosy, I think. Look for the music of a poem. And that's so varied, it's hard to even talk about.
Yeah.
It has to sound like poetry. That's the hard thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Peter.
Ajibola, I've been enjoying your beautiful book, and thank you for that. When I look back to the notes, one of your poems, Embers, is described as an erased poem, and that is an unknown term to me. Can you tell me what an erased poem is?
That poem, Embers, is by a novelist called Sandor Marai, who has a book titled Embers. And it was a book about 2 generals who had met after long years of being apart, and they'd grown up in the same house. And it's something about home. So I took the whole novel and I cut all the words out until we have just that. And when we do erasure, what we are hoping to do is to arrive at something that's contrary to the original intention of the book that we are erasing.
And then when you erase it, is the part that you've left, is it actually intact, or do you mess with it at all?
No, I didn't mess with it.
You don't mess with it. So in that sense, it's almost it's almost a found poem that's
Yeah.
been, interesting, yeah. And I've seen people do that with just particular words too,
Yeah.
that erasure process, yeah.
It was a practice I learned from Mary Ruffle, and she would say she would buy these books, and after she'd read them, she'd just erase them and give them in the library, make poems out of them.
Other questions? Any of you all? Okay, just one last question can you all both name a couple of poets you think have been really influential to you, or poets that you either helped you as you were starting out, or that you still really turn to? You mentioned Mary Oliver, especially during the pandemic, but who are you likely to pick up a book from now?
For me, the most important influences are the early ones.
Are the what?
The early ones. Is this on? Okay. When you start, the people who I read when I was 15, 16, 18, 20. So Federico Garcia Lorca is the main one for me. I mean, actually, I was younger than that because my father used to recite his poems, so he liked the earlier work, not the later surrealistic stuff. He thought that was terrible. But he would recite Verde que te quiero verde and all that while he was shaving, and I would hear it as a child, and it was...
And would he recite it in Spanish or English?
Oh, in Spanish.
Always in Spanish.
Definitely in Spanish.
Yeah.
And then after that, I read, a woman growing up in the 70s, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, that type of thing. I read a lot of Eliot. I used to carry a copy of 4 quartets in my purse.
Oh, wow.
Because it was a little book, so it fit in my purse. But there was one anthology that I found in my high school library. Had probably like 5 poetry books, but one of them was an anthology of the Iowa poets, and this is I'm talking like the 70s. So it was people like Mark Strand and Charles Simic and Marvin Bell. And at that point, I had been reading kind of more academic stuff, Eliot and Pound, and all of a sudden there were these poems that used like a simpler, more direct language, and they had kind of a raw energy to them, and it really changed my life. I mean, I stole the book. I didn't steal it. I checked it out. I just never returned it. I still have it, in fact.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because I'm like, all those poets.
Yeah.
Wisława Szymborska, like, I think she's Polish, and there's just something about the way the language is so sharp, it cuts you. Derek Walcott, I love Derek for his ability to just write about human journeys. Philip Levine, the music of Levine is incredible, his sense of image. The music of his narration, it's almost like an old man speaking to you of a time in Detroit that you were not there and you should long to be there. Levine. Louise Gleek, she was my former professor.
She was?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Huh.
She's phenomenal. Evan Jordan wrote the book Magnolia, incredible book. Roger Reeves for his particular approach to writing Black literature. Kai Miller, there's this Jamaican poet, Kai Miller, who's very musical. And so all those poets, there's a lot of them. Martin Espada, I love and love Martin Espada. I continue to read those poets. They're the ones that are closest to me.
Let's see, have you mentioned a Nigerian poet? or
No,
I don't think I know.
Not.
Yeah.
Now I have to do that because the Nigerians are watching me closely.
No, you don't. No pressure.
There is the Nigerian poet Wole Soyinka, whose book Samarkand and Other Markets I Have Known is always on my nightstand because of how he thinks about journeys from global south westward. And then, I read some of my own contemporaries too, Romeo Riogun, Gbenga Adesina. These are poets who are doing phenomenal work.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much for terrific readings and your good words. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. Go out and buy some books if you want. Okay. Good evening.